So after this week, we can all mark ourselves as Facebook safe from the Bread of Life discourse of Year B. This is the last week of following the Gospel of John. And next week, we'll turn back to the Gospel of Mark, who in comparison will seem abrupt and nearly rude with his literary brevity. It's been 5 weeks of digging into the 6th chapter of John's Gospel, beginning, if you can remember that far back, with the feeding of the 5,000 and those simple loaves and fish procured by a local child and given to Jesus and his disciples. So if you haven't been to a lectionary-based service in the last 5 weeks, allow me to fill you in, as we do. Jesus feeds the 5,000 out of compassion for them out of 5 loaves and 2 fish. He then crosses a sea, and a bunch of the people that he fed follows him there. And then what happens is a masterclass in teaching by Jesus. Jesus says to the people, "Remember those fish and that bread that we all ate? That was like another miracle, just like the manna which God provided those who had escaped from Egypt under Moses. It's not just a party trick, it's a metaphor." And the people following her like, "Oh yes, we see the connection, it is very meta." And then Jesus says, "So that miracle bread, that shows God's love and loyalty? I am that bread." And the people said, "Yes, you are." And Jesus says, "So bread is meant to be shared and reminds us not only of God, but of one another, right?" And the people say, "We got it. Bread is shared and a metaphor." And then Jesus says, stay with me, friends. So bread needs to be consumed to fully engage with it, not just as like a one-time thing, but again and again for sustenance for life. And the people following him are all, "Eat the bread, eat the bread, eat the bread." Or croissants, as per Abby's sermon last week. And then Jesus says, okay, so if I am the bread of life, and the bread of life must be consumed because it's not just a metaphor for God's love, because literally here I am standing with you guys because I am one with God, you need to eat my flesh and drink my blood. And then, and this is not the exact translation from the Kini Greek, and then there were crickets. And the people probably had many verbalized responses to Jesus' statement about eating his flesh and drinking his blood. But the gospel that John chooses to record is very politic. And he writes, "This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it?" It's worth pointing out that the people we're talking about are not the simple, casual observers of Jesus. They aren't just dipping into this itinerant rabbi's one-time show. The folks who are following Jesus are actually following Jesus. They were the ones who crossed the sea in order to then experience 5 weeks of the bread of metaphor slowly expanding or rising. I know, bad puns, friends. Last of the 5 weeks. So the ones who are listening at this point aren't just the crowds any longer, and they're not just the authorities who have a pointed agenda for their attendance. And that's the 2 examples that we've heard to this time in the Gospel of John. But John calls these crowds disciples several times, even when they get to this point where they are wondering if cannibalism is on the doctrine docket for this Jesus. I mean, and metaphorically, it works on paper, that set of images. If Jesus is the bread of life, if Jesus is not only co-eternal with God, but co-existent, and therefore the incarnation of God, then this bread, which is the relationship with God, holiness found in the mundane, isn't just a metaphor, it needs to be fully consumed. And by consumption of the bread, Jesus means himself, fully, unabashedly, flesh and blood, the incarnation of God standing before them. And maybe on paper, that metaphor is still not great. But then again, the intimacy of relationship with God is explicit in some ways. Belief, faith, resurrection, those relationships, those feelings aren't based on good thoughts, but require a whole body investment. And when we are asked to invest ourselves fully in something, be it situational or emotional or mental, we have to relinquish our investment in other places. Jesus isn't just content with metaphor or positive vibes. Jesus knows that humanity loves the idea of abundance and will always, if given the chance, move towards the more gained with less at stake path. And Jesus now lays down the stakes. It's not just a snack. He's our sustenance. So I want to explore the phenomenon called selective hearing. There is a 1983 movie called The Man with Two Brains. Does anyone remember this movie? Holy mackerel, wow, no one. It's not great. It's a riff, but yet again, I watch it, so there you go. So it's a riff off that mad scientist story genre, and it stars Steve Martin. Steve Martin's character is a widower who, in the early part of the movie, is attracted to another woman, even despite his devotion to the memory of his late wife. And in an early scene, Martin stands in front of the portrait of his late wife, Rebecca, because there are zero subtle movie references in this film, and says to the portrait, full of feeling, "Rebecca, if there is anything wrong with my feelings for Dolores, just give me a sign." And in response, her portrait begins to spin. A wind roars around Martin, a wailing "no!" And, emits from the room. The walls crack, they split. The chaos continues, and then it lessens. And there is a beat of silence. And Martin responds, "Just any kind of sign. I'll keep on the lookout for it. Meanwhile, I'll just put you in the closet." This teaching is difficult. Who can accept it? In a gospel chapter replete with metaphor and imagery, this concrete response from Jesus' disciples is intensely real. But Jesus asks of those who follow him is far from some sort of fad diet, but rather a conversion to a life proclaiming love, hope, justice, and mercy. We all ask God for signs when we are lost or seeking, no matter how much our theology cognitively may not agree with that kind of personalized epiphany. Yet, if the sign we see isn't quite to our liking, or our comfort, or our taste, or if it requires too much of us, inviting us to see relinquishment as a holy practice, as accumulation, we, like Martin, keep asking for the sign and then putting the sign in the closet. Selective hearing is powerful as anyone who has tried to have a conversation with a teenager, or one's parents, or one's partner, or with anyone who begins a conversation with, "When two people love each other very much." We do it all the time with Jesus. We love the bread. We love to love the bread. We love to think we love the bread. We just forget that bread is more than bread sometimes, that it is less about miraculous performance or reward after an especially good week, and more about intimacy with the divine. And intimacy, as we know, comes with a required and a chosen cost. Jesus saying, "Those who eat my flesh and drink my blood abide in me, and I in them," cost him followers. When we dig through the deepest aspects of our faith, or what holds value to us, we discover that more than anything, that to hold something dearly and deeply requires us to have both hands open and ready to hold it. When we come to the communion table, and if a child or adult is unsure what to do to receive communion, my go-to instruction is, put both your hands out like a plate. While practical in nature, theologically, it's what Jesus asks of us. Both hands in, both hands open, ready to partake in that same shared bread that those followers did 2,000 years ago. And the beautiful part of this, the coda, if you will, to all of this bread of life, is that even those who walk away from Jesus in today's gospel, those who just cannot with the metaphor of flesh and blood and are not ready to dig in, notice John's language for the people. They are still disciples. As they walk away from Jesus, they are still disciples. We are still loved, even when the cost seems too great for the return. And we discover that our risk aversion leads us to selectively hear Jesus' words to us. God's love is made real for us, church. In Jesus, in shared bread, in one another, in the things we put in the closet. Amen.